You still answer to your name, you still recognize your face in the mirror, you go to work, you answer the messages, you remember the birthdays, you solve the problems, you show up when someone needs you. From the outside, you are still completely yourself. And yet sometimes, in a quiet moment, usually when no one is asking anything of you, a strange and slightly unsettling thought appears. I don't feel like me anymore, not dramatically, not as a crisis, just a quiet observation, almost clinical, that the person living this life feels slightly less familiar than they used to. If you are still here, where did you go? It almost never happens in a single day. There is no morning when you wake up and decide to become someone else. No moment when the old self steps aside and a new, blander, more functional version takes over. It happens the way most things happen in a life, gradually, through accumulation. A responsibility is added, then another. A role becomes established, the reliable one, the one who handles things, the one people call when something goes wrong. And the role, because it is practiced daily, because it is asked for and reinforced and rewarded, begins to run automatically. You become very good at being needed, and in becoming very good at it, certain parts of you receive less attention. Not abandoned, not rejected, just occupied. Moved temporarily to the periphery, while the center becomes organized around what life requires. The temporary becomes a year, the year becomes 5, and one day you pause long enough to notice that the periphery has become unfamiliar. Psychology and neuroscience don't offer a single clean explanation for what we call the self. There is no region in the brain that houses a you, no central system that stores the authentic version and releases it on command. What we experience as a self appears to emerge from multiple interacting systems working together. Memory, particularly autobiographical memory, the ongoing story you tell yourself about who you are and what has happened to you. Prediction, the brain's continuous, largely automatic process of generating expectations about what kind of person you are, how you tend to respond, what is consistent with the version of yourself you have been. Behavior, what you repeatedly do, which creates evidence that the brain uses to update and reinforce its model of who you are. Roles, the positions you occupy in relation to other people, which come with scripts and expectations and habitual ways of responding that over years can begin to feel less like a role and more like the self itself. The self, in other words, is not simply something you have. It is something that is continuously being constructed by memory, by repetition, by what you practice, by what you give your attention to and what you quietly stop attending to. And that means something important. If the self is partly built through repeated experience and behavior, then what happens to the parts of ourselves that stop receiving experience? A part of you does not need to die to become unfamiliar. It only needs to go without practice for long enough. Think about what might have quietly contracted, not dramatically, not all at once, but over time, under pressure, in the presence of real and legitimate responsibility. The thing that used to make time disappear. A creative interest, a physical activity, a particular kind of conversation. When did you last do it? When did it stop being available? Curiosity? Unprompted. Not the practical curiosity of problem solving, but the kind that follows something simply because it is interesting, with no particular destination and no one waiting for the result. Solitude that was genuinely chosen. Not the exhausted collapse of an evening after everything has been managed, but a space carved out for something that only you needed. Risk. Not the financial kind necessarily, but the risk of being a beginner at something, of not knowing, of trying something where you might fail in front of yourself and not be able to pretend otherwise. Play. The genuine, slightly purposeless version. Desire. Not for something useful, not for an outcome that helps anyone, but for something simply because some part of you wanted it. These are not trivial things. They are the texture of a self, and texture requires ongoing experience to remain familiar. Here is something worth understanding about how the brain manages a busy life. Repeated routines become efficient. When you have done something many times, the morning sequence, the work commute, the evening responsibilities, the brain requires less conscious deliberation to execute it. It builds a compressed, efficient model of what comes next, and runs the sequence with less active participation than it once required. This is one of the brain's most important abilities. Without it, the ordinary complexity of adult life would be cognitively exhausting. But there is a cost that comes with the efficiency. A life that becomes sufficiently predictable, where most of what happens each day is anticipated, familiar, running on well-established tracks, can produce a particular feeling. Not unhappiness exactly, more like absence. The feeling of going through the motions of a life that was once consciously built, but now runs on automatic. You can become very good at living a life you no longer consciously inhabit. And here is where the role can become something more than useful. For many people, the roles in their life, parent, partner, provider, the capable one, the responsible one, are not false. They are real. They matter. The people who depend on you are genuinely there. The care is genuine. But a role practiced long enough and consistently enough can begin to feel like identity. Not because it is the whole self, but because it is the most rehearsed self, the most automatic, the most available, the most familiar. When someone asks how you are doing, the role answers. When a situation requires a response, the role produces one before conscious deliberation has fully formed. The role is not lying, but the role is also not all of you. And when most of the day, most of the week, most of the year is organized around what the role requires, the parts of you the role has no use for begin to feel distant. You can be present in someone else's life every day and still be absent from your own. The temptation at this point is to ask, who was I before all of this? To try to locate the original self, the version before the responsibilities accumulated, the person before the roles took over. But that question may not be quite the right one. The self you had at 25 existed under completely different conditions, different relationships, different demands, different knowledge, different losses, different experiences. Going back to that version of yourself is not really possible. And more honestly, it is probably not what you actually want. What you are looking for is not a younger you. What you are looking for may be the experience of being present in your own life, of doing something because you want to rather than because it is required, of being surprised by yourself, of encountering some part of yourself that you had not expected. So what actually helps? Not a list of self-care instructions, not a directive to take a sabbatical or find a hobby. Something more precise than that. The self is partly built through behavior, which means that waiting to feel like yourself before you act is exactly backwards. The feeling of being yourself, of recognizing yourself, of feeling present and inhabiting your own life, often follows behavior rather than preceding it. Not because fake it until you make it is a psychological truth, but because the brain learns from what you do. When you try something genuinely unfamiliar, the brain is required to actively engage rather than predict and autocomplete. When you return to an abandoned interest, even imperfectly, even slowly, even far below the level you once had, you give the brain new experience of a part of yourself that had been receiving none. When you choose something because you want it, rather than because someone needs it from you, the brain registers a different kind of agency than it has been practicing. None of this is fast. The self that returns from long disuse does not return in a weekend, but the brain does not require dramatic transformation. It requires repeated experience, small encounters with the parts of yourself that have been waiting. Not because they were lost, because they were unvisited. Here is the other thing worth saying. The parts of you that became less practiced, the curiosity, the creativity, the desire, the willingness to be a beginner, did not disappear because you made a wrong choice. They contracted because life is finite, because time is finite, because you made choices about where to direct your attention, your energy, your years, and some of those choices were good ones, made for people who matter, for reasons that were real. This is not a story about a life that went wrong. It is a story about a life that went very full. Full enough that certain things were quietly set aside, not lost, set aside. And the question is not how to recover something that was stolen. The question is what you want to give experience to next. Return one final time to the ceiling. 2 hands, 2 fingers. The gap. In this episode, the gap is not between God and Adam. It is not between ambition and achievement. It is between the identity you have spent years practicing into fluency and the parts of yourself that have been waiting patiently for you to practice them again. The gap is not evidence of failure, it is evidence of space. Space between what you have become through repetition and responsibility and years of being needed,
and what you could still become if you began giving experience to the parts of yourself that have had none. Perhaps you were never something that could simply be found. Perhaps you have always been something still being built. And the building is not finished, because you are not finished. The identity you carry today is the result of what has been practiced so far. It is not the verdict, it is the draft. Every neuron remembers, every thought changes you, every choice rewrites you. The gap is still there, the spark is still crossing. So become.